Welcome to the MAM Journals. Today I'm going to be talking about my Royal Enfield Big Bore project, which some of you have been kind enough to follow on my previous videos, but some of you, this may be completely new to you. What I'm going to be talking about is what I've done on the bike, and I'm going to break that into three sections. I'm going to talk about what I've done on the engine, I'm going to talk about what I've done to the suspension, and aesthetically what changes have been made. I'll obviously talk about what that all cost and what power and performance we've now got out of the engine and what it actually rides like. I'm then going to do a section called I'm going to call it frequently asked questions. A few of you have actually been either messaging me or putting comments on previous videos asking me various questions, and I'll try and cover some of those off. And finally, I'm going to be talking about what sort of conclusions and how I feel about the bike and what my plans are going forward. So I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, so looking at the sort of process overall, as I mentioned on previous videos, but if you didn't watch them, just to recap, the importance of when you're trying to improve engine performance, if you just go back to sort of fundamentals, you need to get air and fuel in the right amount, you need to set light to it at the right time, and then you need to get it all out again and make sure there's no constraints along the process. So when I talk about the engine, I'm going to try and do it logically. What we've done underneath there is obviously the air filter. So the first thing starting from that end was obviously to change that, and we put a K&N air filter in there and changed the backing plate to allow it to breathe a little bit better, and that cost a grand sum of £58. You then need to buy a big bore kit, and that is the S&S big bore kit fitted onto there, and that is the 865cc. They do a 750, but which I initially sort of thought about for a short while, because that would have been actually closer to the original Interceptor, but actually I came to the conclusion, well, it might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb, and that cost £216. You then obviously you need to bore out the old barrel in an overbore. That was £312. There's a bit more engineering involved in that than perhaps you might envisage, because there's a lip on there that needs to be machined in, but they did a very nice job on that. You then need to get all that gas flowed, and gas flowing is really about taking metal out of the head in order to allow the flow to be nice and even throughout the process. And it's halfway between a science and an art, and they're taking metal essentially out of the intakes along the head, in the squish area, and then the exhaust ports. The team that worked on that was Viv Cowley and one of his former colleagues from TWR, which is Tom Walkinshaw Racing, no longer exists, but I think it's really important to get people who really do understand that stuff. And actually the guy who did the science behind this actually built for Tom Walkinshaw Racing the 1988 Jaguar engine that won Le Mans, so I was fairly confident that I had somebody who could cope with trying to get a little bit more power out of a twin cylinder Royal Enfield, and they did a great job on it. You then need to obviously build headers, and again Viv Cowley did that and built them. They look very similar in diameter to actually the standards, but they haven't got any inners to them, so it does actually significantly increase the bore there, and that flows right the way through. On the standard bike, which you're still legally allowed to do but may not in the future, there's a catalytic converter about there, but obviously this hasn't got it because it needs to allow the whole flow to go through, and there's little point in getting it flowing through the engine and then stopping it when it gets to the cat at the back. Now what we did here, we fitted S&S silencers on it, and a pair of those cost £571. And by the way, the work for the gas flowing and the building of the headers and the welding involved in the joints on that came to about £900. In terms of the overall project, Craig very reasonably charged me £600 labour, but that is because I did quite a bit of the stuff myself and a bit of the running around to support the team. I think if I hadn't done anything, it would probably have been maybe another 500 to 600 on top of that. So, but obviously, depending on how much stuff you do yourself, that labour charge will go up or down. Having then done all the mechanical sort of side of it, and the engineering side of it, you then need to get it remapped. Now, what we did with this, we took it to Dave Wood's Racing in Buckingham, and they did actually a remap on the ECU. There's no power commander on this. They actually reprogrammed the ECU to deliver the power that we were hoping to achieve. So what power did that produce? Well, most of you are probably familiar that there's a difference there's two ways of measuring power, and most manufacturers of course go for the higher number, which is at the crank there. So what do you got at the front end? And then of course what we actually use when we're riding is what's coming out the back on the back wheel. So I'm going to give you both of those numbers, which their machine is capable of doing, which is not everybody's are, but they've invested quite a lot in their equipment. So at the front, that now produces 70 brake horsepower at 7,000 revs, which is towards the top end, but its torque is 79 Newton meters, and it produces it at 4,955, which is nicely just over the mid-range point. So nice and accessible power. At the rear wheel, I work on the theory that, broadly speaking, and mostly works, if you take 10% off the crank and say that's what you're going to get, it actually works bang on here. 63 brake horsepower, well 62.8 at the back wheel at 7,131 revs, and it produced 69 Newton meters at 5,108. So that theory works pretty well, and it's producing a good increase in power from the standard of 47. So it's a significant improvement in performance, as you'd expect, because the total cost of the engine work, and I'm going to call it that, is £3,974. So I've called it £4,000. So that's where the bulk of my spend has gone on this particular bike. People have occasionally asked me, well, what else are you doing? Have you done anything with brakes? No, they're absolutely standard, and I'll leave it like that. I've not had any issues with the brakes, other than the recall earlier, but with that wasn't affecting the performance of the bike. And I'm okay with them. If I do find that I'm riding it so enthusiastically the brakes aren't coping, then the first thing I'd do is obviously just change the pads as a logical next step. I've left the clutch as standard, and some people, when they do a big bore, they change the clutch. I view the clutch as a service item, and if it turns out, I'll put another one in, and I'll put the one with the extra plate in. So no, in terms of extra performance out of the bike, other options that I was given, but I declined, as it can run away with you, this thing. You can, of course, change the throttle bodies and put different valves in, and you will increase the power again. But for me, this was within the scope of what I wanted to do. But anyway, let's have a look at the video when the bike was on the dyno. Well, having sorted out the engine, the next logical place to look is, well, what are you going to do about suspension and handling? I think the actual geometry and design of the Interceptor is sound. It's nicely been done nicely, and a lot of people don't know, but Royal Enfield actually bought Harris Performance, who knew quite a few things about chassis design and framework. So I think it's essentially good, but they fitted suspension units and front forks that were down to a price rather than up to a quality in order to hit the price point. And I therefore, I certainly felt with the standard equipment bike, I rode it on various roads, and some of the roads I went on were fairly undulating, and the front bottomed out quite quickly, and then the rear came out in sympathy. So it got a bit interesting on occasions, and if I'm honest, I would be changing the suspension on the bike even if I hadn't done the big bore, because I think it's an easy and obvious place to improve the bike's handling and ride. I did think about buying nitrons, because I've got it fitted to a couple of bikes and I'm very fond of the product. It works well for me. It's quite complex, the nitrons, and that level of complexity and adjustability comes at a price, and I thought the price, which was £1,400, was too much for a project of this type. So I started looking for something that was somewhere in the middle, and I got on Facebook. I'm a member of a number of groups, and I got in contact with Paul Messenger, who runs one of the groups and is a very nice and helpful guy, and he said to me, well, why don't you come and try my bike? I've put YSS on mine and I'm very pleased with it. And I did. I met up with him. I took it out for a ride. Now, Paul's a little bit bigger than I am, and so his settings on his preload at the front were certainly higher than I put onto these. But well, I'll just talk through what you've actually got on it. The front, they're inserts. Well, they use part of the original equipment, but they change the spring, and essentially they improve the valving by putting something that's called an emulator in there, which gives you a bit more control. You've got no adjustability in terms of rebound or compression, and you've just got preload adjustment via those knobs there. At the rear, I went for the what's called Zs, and essentially you've got, again, preload through the threaded and nut there. You've got rebound adjustment via this gnarled knob at the bottom, and then if actually you look, and I didn't notice or think about it very much when I ordered them, you've actually got adjustment of the length of the shock at the bottom there, so it means you can do height adjustment without clumsily trying to do it through your preload and sag height. So good competent set of shocks, which cost me in total, the suspension upgrade cost me £600, and the bike rides very well. I might make some changes at the front, but I'll touch on that a bit later. But I think it's improved it significantly from the standard without absolutely breaking the bank balance and getting out of shape with too much money on suspension. But everybody's got their own choices about that. That's the one that I've gone for, the YSS system. Aesthetically, obviously, such things are very personal. What I've done on the bike is, I'll start at the front, seems semi-logical. Some of you may recall that the standard Enfield is silver there, so we painted that black, as indeed we have the front brace. So they were just a couple of small touches. Put a new set of handlebars on the bike, and just slightly unusual here, we've actually put the indicators in the end of the handle grips, and they're LEDs, and those bars and indicators cost £277. Obviously it depends on what choice of bars you have and what indicators you go for. You can either spend more or less than that should you wish. At the back here we've done a bit more. I actually had to cut a bit of stuff away from the frame. I went for a solo seat, as you can see. So we had to get that seat remoulded so that it could have a different shape to it, and then recovered, and then I went for the red stitching on it. That seat cost £365, and the fabrication in order to make it work, because at the same time I was wanting to make that sort of uplift there, as you can see, compare that to the standard, then that's a far more straight, and there was a lot of, I describe it as paraphernalia on the back there, and we wanted to declutter it. So Viv Cowley did a lot of that work and cut, re-welded and repainted where required. And we also took, because we'd gone to a solo and we wanted those S&S silencers to be at a more of an angle, fabricated a new attachment there and took off from that frame section there, cut off the supports that were previously on it, so, and then repainted it. So that fabrication work and also some work underneath the back here, we took off the rear mud guard and created another bracket down there. The total work for that was about £300 from Viv to do that particular work. And we also took the front mudguard cover off as well down there, which is, I like the look of it. In fairness, it's probably not a bike you want to wear and ride around in the middle of winter. I have done 250 miles on it, and in some pretty sloppy weather with lots of salt around. It did take me, it did manage to get the salt everywhere, but I've just about managed to get it clean subsequently. But the total amount of spend that I've done on what I describe as the sort of visual stroke aesthetics is £978. I'm very pleased with the outcome, but I'll be the first to recognise that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So whether or not you like it personally is your own personal choice, and I respect that. I said in my introduction that I'd do frequently asked questions, so I've just made a few notes on those. The first and most commonly asked question was really along the lines of why bother, and I would say primarily for fun. I have slightly been influenced by what I think in the UK will be impending legislation where you won't be allowed to do projects like this, and I thought I'd probably get in before that occurs. They might retrospectively apply it, but I think that's probably unlikely. So I struck when the iron was hot. Why don't you buy a Triumph? Well, yeah, it's a good question. Well, I've actually had three. I had two Bonnevilles, and I had actually one of the very early Thruxtons, which, in fairness, although I like the later ones, and the least said about the earlier one, probably the better. The Bonnevilles were okay, and when I actually bought this bike, I did actually think, well, shall I buy this one or a Bonneville? And came to the conclusion I'd probably have more fun buying one of these with significantly less money, and then spending about the same money again, actually making it something a bit more individual and personal for my tastes. Is it return on capital? I love that question. Short answer, no. You can buy an awful lot for the amount of money that I've spent on this bike, and lots of different bikes and far more significant performance, but I'm happy with what I've done with it. Is the warranty void? Yes, to all intents and purposes. Once you start modifying engines, you're unlikely to get any manufacturer to want to cover and give you a warranty on that. What I actually did with Craig, who built the bike, is I sort of walked towards it and said, Craig, what happens if my big bore turns into a big bang? And I thought he took a very reasonable approach and said, look, I'll build the engine personally, and I'm happy to cover you for 6 months, which I think is more than enough, really. My experience of modifying bikes is if they are going to go bang, they'll go quicker. They'll go bang far quicker than 6 months. Did you have to run it in again? Yeah, that's a good question. Not fully. Obviously, when you put new pistons in a bike, you do have to just sort of bed those in, and you're talking about microns of metal that you have to sort of wear in. And there's two things I'd sort of say on that in terms of how they did it, and that's it's important talking to people who understand these things far more than I do. The importance of heat cycles, i.e. warm the bike up, letting it cool again during its initial period, a short initial run just to put a few miles on it. They then put heat cycles on it when they were putting it through the dyno process, and I've done about 250 miles gently on it, just increasing revs. So yeah, you need to be a bit careful. One thing I would mention, sometimes people sort of talk about it on forums about, well, the oil they put in initially isn't very good. It's actually deliberately designed to do that, because if you put, this bike runs on fully synthetic oil, if you put that in a running in period, it actually stops it running in, because obviously the idea of fully synthetic is it gives you full coverage, and there's little opportunity for wear in the engine. So actually you run it on cheaper oils, which are more likely to facilitate the wear, and then later on, once you run it in, you then put your fully synthetic in. Are you worried about reliability? No. Nothing is certain in life, and even bikes that haven't been modified can occasionally prove not to be reliable. But no, I don't worry about it. I took the view that with this particular bike, if worse comes to worse and it goes bang, then either I'll sort something out with Craig and we'll have another go, or alternatively, I have to be in a position where I can just accept that it hasn't worked out. So no, I'm not overly worried about that, but I think I'm very fortunate in the position I'm in. I've got quite a few bikes, and if this was my only bike and I needed it for my form of transport or even to commute, then maybe I wouldn't have been so brave. But in my circumstances, no, I've taken that risk on board. What impact will it have on resale? Well, there's sort of a couple of ways of modifying bikes really, and the clever people, when they modify bikes to suit their own purposes, what they tend to do is take off the standard components, fit upgrades, and then when they come to resell it, they take all the upgrades off and sell the bike back as standard, and then tend to sell on the parts that they bought, and that seems to be a reasonably cost-efficient way of doing customization. But that's one way of doing it. But this way, when you're actually fundamentally changing the engine and you're trimming away at the frame and various other bits, I think specials, customized one-off builds, are notoriously difficult to resell. So if my intention was to sell this on quite quickly, then I wouldn't suggest that the sort of level of modification I've done makes much sense. But I've taken the view that this is probably a long-term holder for me, and I'm not going to worry too much about it. Other question, well, what happens with your insurance? Well, obviously you've got to tell your broker or your insurer that you have modified the bike. My broker is long-suffering and very accommodating. He knows that I'm constantly changing bikes and constantly doing things with him. And when I rang him up and said, oh, by the way, I've bought another couple of bikes and I've put a big ball kit on this, he laughed, and I think it was tens of pounds rather than hundreds, in order to accommodate it. I think quite rightly he's taken the risk that this bike is still actually the slowest bike that the slowest bike that I've got, and his risk probably lies in some of the ones that are a little brisker. But anyway, no, it wasn't huge. You do have to tell, in the UK, there's a licensing authority called the DVLA, and you do have to sort of tell them, but it's quite straightforward in the UK. If you're watching from the UK, I know a lot of you aren't actually UK based, but if you are, then you can just get on the computer and you just put in there that you put a bigger engine on it, and that's that bit dealt with. So very straightforward. I'm sure there'll be lots of other questions, and please feel free to either put them in the comments below or just message me directly, and I'll do my best to answer them as clearly and as quickly as I can. Right, so what are my conclusions on the bike? Well, certainly I've had a lot of fun doing it. It's been a really enjoyable process. It's taken 11 weeks from start to finish in terms of handing them the keys and me getting my keys and the bike back, which I think is a very sensible timescale, and certainly it was pretty close to what originally thought, but we were slightly disturbed by having Christmas in the middle of it. But I think that's a sensible timescale to get something, and I think the reason we managed to do that is because the importance of picking the right team. and you've got to agree who's going to do things and how you're going to work with them in advance. I might actually do a short video on that, because I'm conscious that some people watching, you've done lots of projects like this, and you know exactly how to sort of manage the process and how to get involved or not get involved. But there are maybe others watching who actually have never done anything like this. And if you want a bit of guidance on that and you think a video might be useful, then just please let me know, put in the comments, and I'll be happy to put one together how I've sort of got involved and how I sort of made sure I was involved enough but not too much to interfere. I would actually like to take this opportunity to thank the people who have been involved, and Viv Cowley and his colleagues who worked on the engine work. I'd just like to express my thanks to them for their expertise and knowledge. Dave Woods, both of them. Dave Woods Racing is actually a father and son team, and just to keep you confused, they're both called Dave. But I'd like to thank them for their help in the ECU remap that they put forward. And of course, most of all, I'd like to thank Craig Polden at King's Two Wheels Centre in Kidlington in Oxford for overseeing the whole project and for keeping me so well informed. You did a great job, guys. Thank you. So what am I going to do now? The danger with any sort of project like this is you can get carried away and you can end up endlessly changing things, and that is sort of fun, but I am going to try and be quite disciplined now and say, right, it's worked out to plan and to budget. I've spent £5,500 on it in total. That was broadly where I wanted it to be, and I'll probably leave it like that for a while and enjoy. I'm now out of the running in stage and into the wearing out stage, so I'm probably going to go and have some miles on it and enjoy it. A couple of things I might sort of look at. I do like aesthetically, I like what I've done with these indicators and the way that they work. I worry slightly that it doesn't give other motorists a bit of a clue about what I'm doing at the back here. So I'll see how I go with that. I might end up having to come up with a slightly different solution. And although I am very pleased with the suspension and what's been done on that, and as I say, my thanks to Paul for his assistance on that regard. You can't adjust the front, as I touched on earlier, in other than preload, but I might just soften the oil just to make it a bit softer. It's this is, the setup that it's got is actually very competent, but everybody's got individual preferences, and the setup is about what an individual likes, and I like mine slightly softer than what is probably considered by most as being the optimum, so I might just loosen the front a bit. But other than that, I'm just going to spend my time running around the Oxfordshire countryside and having fun. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and most of all, I hope that you found it informative and useful. And if you have, perhaps you'd be kind enough to press like or even subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this sort of presentation and way of talking about things. But most of all, I hope that you ride safe and stay well.